Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, BBC managers are said to be deeply unimpressed over a recording of the Radio 4 Today programme host, John Humphrys, joking about the gender pay gap. A leaked transcript of an off-air conversation between the presenter and BBC correspondent John Sopel appears to show Mr Humphrys making light of former China editor Carrie Gracie's resignation over pay issues, claiming his own large salary is entirely just. He's described the exchange as silly banter. But one woman who heard the recording says it's smug and condescending. Jane Death reports.
On Monday morning, Carrie Gracie presented the Today programme opposite John Humphrys, while the story of her row with the BBC over equal pay swirled around her.
Perhaps listeners would expect me to do a really tough interview with you about that bombshell letter, but the BBC has rules on impartiality which mean that presenters can't suddenly turn into interviewees.
But off-air, John Humphrys was happy to discuss the story. Before the show, he was about to record an item with John Sopel. The North America editor Carrie Gracie was complaining was paid substantially more than her. The men were caught on tape. The transcript goes like this.
The first question will be how much of your salary you're prepared to hand over to Carrie Gracie to keep her. And then a few comments about your other colleagues, you know, like our Middle East editor and the other men who are earning too much.
I mean, obviously, if we're talking about the scope for the greatest redistribution, I'll have to come back and say, well, yes, Mr Humphrys, but...
And I could save you the trouble, as I could volunteer that I've handed over already more than you earn, but I'm still left with more than anybody else. And that seems to me to be entirely just. Something like that would do it.
Don't.
Oh, dear God. She's actually suggested that you should lose money. You know that, don't you? You've read the thing properly, have you?
The leak was big news this morning, but Today didn't touch it. The story didn't make Radio 4's bulletins until after John Humphrys was off-air.
The BBC has said John Humphrys regrets an ill-advised off-air conversation where he appeared to make light of the gender pay row.
The presenters said it was two old friends taking the mickey out of each other and nothing to do with Carrie Gracie's campaign. But some question why he and Evan Davis, who discussed the equal pay row on Twitter, are still allowed to present coverage of the story, while Radio 4's Winifred Robinson was taken off air on Tuesday after backing Carrie Gracie online. And Jane Garvey, who also supports her cause, wasn't allowed to interview her on Woman's Hour. The BBC denies double standards, saying John Humphrys hasn't broken impartiality rules because his off-air comments weren't him campaigning on equal pay. But he's been reminded of the golden rule: never say anything in front of a microphone you wouldn't want broadcast.
And this programme understands the Today team knew about the leaked tape for several days, but didn't consider taking John Humphrys off air because they deemed it a private conversation. Well, one person who has actually heard the recording is the former Country File presenter Miriam O'Reilly, who won an ageism claim a few years ago against the BBC at an employment tribunal. She was booked to appear on the Today programme this morning, but was dropped by a producer yesterday. I asked her why she thought that had happened.
I told the producer I was having a final briefing with yesterday that I heard the recording of John Humphrys and John Sopel sneering and being arrogant and condescending about equal pay and Carrie Gracie. And within minutes, he came back and he said, Miriam, you know how it is, news moves on, and we won't have room on the programme for you now. Well, and at that point, I realised that they didn't like the idea that I had heard that recording, because if John Humphrys was going to interview me, then I would definitely have raised it live on air.
Well, the BBC said today that, you know, often they make changes to contributors before broadcast. The item became much broader discussion about social change, and so Afua Hirsch, who was then on the programme, was a more suitable guest to talk about wider issues. That's a legitimate defence, isn't it?
It was just that their decision to drop me after discussing my appearance over 2 days came minutes after I told the producer, just minutes after I told the producer, that I had heard the recording and that I had it, and that I don't believe that their decision to have a discussion about, yes, as they called it, a broader discussion about social change came about that quickly.
So you have heard the tape. What is your judgment of hearing that tape?
You don't get a real sense of John Humphrys' tone, of course, from seeing it written down, which was very sneering. To be fair to John Sopel, he seemed reluctant to be drawn into this.
So lots of female broadcasters at the BBC have been taken off air on stories on gender pay because they've campaigned in support of Carrie Gracie, the China editor who stood down from her post in protest. John Humphrys went on this morning to present an item on the Me Too campaign and the discussion that you would have been part of. How does that strike you?
It's why I started tweeting yesterday the contents of the recording, because I think it is outrageous that a man who clearly is biased should still be on air, and the BBC are allowing him to continue on air when he is not impartial.
Let me get this straight then. Are you calling for him to be taken off air on gender pay stories, suspended after these comments have been made public, or sacked?
I think he should be taken off air when there is any discussion at all on gender pay. Winifred Robinson was stood down from You and Yours because she tweeted her support for Carrie Gracie and equal pay. Jane Garvey on Woman's Hour can't take part in a discussion either, but John Humphrys can. It seems to me if that continues, it absolutely shows that there is one rule for male presenters at the BBC and another for female presenters.
Miriam O'Reilly talking to me earlier, and in response to those claims from Miriam O'Reilly that she was dropped from the Today programme over her knowledge of the Humphrys-Sopel conversation, a BBC spokesperson told us the Today programme often makes changes to schedules and contributors in the run-up to broadcast. This item became a much broader discussion about social change, and consequently Afua Hirsch was a more suitable guest to talk about the wider issues. It's wrong to suggest anything else. And we have asked John Humphrys for a comment, but he's yet to reply. Krish.
They need a head of values.
To the long list of TV and radio presenters caught out by an off-air remark, we now have to add one of the most experienced of all. John Humphrys, the star BBC presenter at the centre of a row over equal pay, insisted tonight that it was all a joke between old friends that did not in any way represent his views on the issue.
That happens again, that sort of thing.
One of the best-known BBC voices, John Humphrys is also one of its highest-paid stars.
So it is the general knowledge round now.
Today, the presenter and host of Mastermind tried to defuse claims he was against equal pay for women.
That's complete rubbish. Obviously, that's complete rubbish, not least because I've said many, many times I'm totally in support of equal pay for equal work, men and women.
On Monday, he presented the Today programme with Carrie Gracie after she resigned as BBC China editor. During an off-air chat with the BBC's North America editor, John Sopel, there was this exchange.
The first question will be how much of your salary you're prepared to hand over to Carrie Gracie to keep her, and then a few comments about your other colleagues and the other men who are earning too much.
I mean, obviously, if we're talking about the scope for the greatest redistribution, I'll have to come back and say, well, yes, Mr. Humphrys, but...
And I could save you the trouble, as I could volunteer that I've handed over already more than you earn, but I'm still left with more than anybody else, and that seems to me to be entirely just. Something like that would do it.
Don't.
Oh, dear God. She's actually suggested that you should lose money. You know that, don't you?
We are in the habit, John and I, of winding each other up. And the purpose of this jokey, emphasise jokey exchange was a bit of mutual mickey-taking. And that is all it was.
The BBC described this off-air conversation as ill-advised, but said that since John Humphrys hadn't made public his views on whether men and women should be paid equally, he was still seen as impartial and would continue to conduct interviews on the subject. Former Country File presenter Miriam O'Reilly, who won an age discrimination battle against the BBC, has heard the leaked audio.
The type of language that John Humphrey used and the tone in which he said it made it very clear to me that he is not impartial in this issue of equal pay. I would say there was a definite bias there.
All right. But tonight, Mr. Humphrys insisted this was a bit of banter, never meant for public consumption. Juliet Bremner, News at 10.